All right, Bill, sit down. This is
Colonel Marcus Fielding.
retired. Yep, yes, yeah, only a question though, not a story. Marcus.
Thank you. I'm going to try and make this bloody microphone work. I don't need to say to this room, or this audience, that the Second World War was obviously a significant geostrategic inflection point in Australia's development as a nation. One of the lesser known chapters of that story is that of a large and close neighbour to our north, one where a long-standing and friendly European colonial power at the start of the war became a newly formed, ethnically fractious Muslim-majority republic. This is the story of how the Dutch East Indies became Indonesia. To understand the tumultuous events that occurred during and immediately after the Second World War, we must first recall how the Dutch East Indies came about. So you've got a potted history lesson here. In March 1602, the States General of the Netherlands granted a privately owned company, the VOC, or Dutch East India Company, a charter to carry out trading activities, to maintain an army and a navy, to build fortresses, to wage war, and to negotiate treaties across Southeast Asia, to imprison and execute convicts, and even to strike its own coins. The company established a base at Batavia, now called Jakarta, which became the centre of its Asian trading network. Over the next 2 centuries, the company acquired additional ports as trading bases and safeguarded its commercial interests by taking control over surrounding territory. To their original monopolies on nutmeg, peppers, cloves and cinnamon, the company in later colonial administrations expanded and introduced non-indigenous cash crops like coffee, tea, cocoa, tobacco, rubber, sugar, and most famously, opium. Statistically, the VOC eclipsed all of its European rivals in Asian trade. Between 1602 and 1796, the VOC sent nearly 1 million Europeans to work in the Asian trade and netted for their efforts more than 2.5 million tonnes of Asian trade goods. The company realised enormous profits from its spice monopoly and slave trading activities through most of the 17th century. It paid annual dividends, keeping in mind that it was a company, it paid annual dividends to shareholders that averaged approximately 18% of their invested capital year on year for 200 years. Now you know where all that old money comes from in Europe.
Trumpy would be pleased.
Despite its profitability in the late 18th century, increasing piracy, smuggling, corruption and growing administrative costs bankrupted the company, which was formally dissolved in 1799. Recall that this was just 30 years after Captain Cook landed at Botany Bay. They'd already been running for a couple hundred. The VOC's possessions and debt were nationalised in 1800 under the Dutch Republic as the Dutch East Indies and placed under the administration of the Governor-General. During the 19th century, the Dutch fought many wars against indigenous rulers and peoples, which caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. The colony contributed to Dutch global prominence in spice and cash crop trade in the 19th century and coal and oil exploration in the 20th century. The Dutch East Indies was one of the most valuable colonies under European rule, though its profits depended on exploitative labour. Among those Dutch colonial administrators in the Dutch East Indies were my relatives, Hendrik Karl Ramers and his wife Henrika Augustina, who gave birth to their son Hendrik Gerhard Albert Ramers, my great-grandfather, in the coffee plantation post at Solok in Western Sumatra in 1884. Dutch rule reached... Have you got the right slide, Jason? Yeah? Next one. Next one. Next one. And that's not them. But they're looking pretty fancy. Dutch rule reached its greatest territorial extent in the early 20th century with the occupation of Western New Guinea, or what is sometimes called Dutch New Guinea. So moving now to the Second World War in the Pacific. As you all know, the Netherlands capitulated their European territory to Germany on the 14th of May 1940. The royal family fled to exile in Great Britain. The Dutch East Indies administration continued to function. The Governor-General van Stolkenborg declared martial law, ordering 19 German cargo ships to be seized and all German nationals to be interned, pending the liberation of the Netherlands in Europe. On the 27th of September 1940, Germany, Hungary, Italy and Japan signed a treaty outlining spheres of influence, and not surprisingly, the Dutch East Indies fell into Japan's sphere. In late 1941, as Japan began offensive operations in the Pacific, Allied forces formed the short-lived American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, led by Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Wavell, to defend what they called the Malay Barrier. And by the 15th of January 1942, Wavell had established his headquarters on Java. The British general regarded the security of Burma and Australia to be critical and viewed the hundreds of islands in between those geographic ends of his command as expendable bases for delaying operations. But the Japanese advance, as we all know, through Malaya and into Burma proved almost unstoppable. In the second week of January 1942, the Japanese staged several landings in Borneo and the Celebes. On the 23rd of January, they also took Rabaul from the Australians, as we know, and by the end of the month they had moved down the Malay Peninsula, pushing the British Commonwealth forces onto the island of Singapore. ABDA Command appeared unable to hold any of its broad defensive perimeter. On the 10th of January 1942, Japanese forces first invaded the territory of the Dutch East Indies. The rubber plantations and oil fields were crucial to the Japanese war effort. On the 1st of March 1942, they landed in Java, and Allied forces were quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese. On the 8th of March 1942, the Royal Dutch East Indies Army surrendered unconditionally. And in addition to thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors and airmen becoming prisoners of war, approximately 100,000 Dutch and European men, women and children were interred. The Governor-General entered Japanese custody, but he did not surrender civilian power. Maybe there was a translation issue. The Dutch government in exile quickly transferred civilian power to, this is the Dutch government in exile in the UK, transferred civilian power to Lieutenant Governor-General Van Mook, who had by that stage evacuated to Australia. And this legitimisation was used to form the Dutch East Indies government in exile in Australia. It was the only country to do so in the course of the war. Following the destruction of an ABDA strike force at the Battle of Java Sea in February-March 1942, ABDA command effectively ceased to exist. And on the 17th of March, again as we know, the US government appointed Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Allied Commander of a new area of operations, the Southwest Pacific area. In a twist of irony, we did manage to sink one Japanese ship in that period, and it happened to hold all the Japanese trained civil administrators that were going to take over the Dutch East Indies. So unfortunately the Japanese then had a situation where they conquered the territory but had no people or administration to run it, which forced them to then use some locals to fill in those missing layers of the bureaucracy. And some of these people will come back to haunt us in a couple of years' time. A vast majority of the indigenous Dutch East Indies population first welcomed the Japanese as liberators from the colonial Dutch Empire, but this sentiment changed as the occupation turned out to be far more oppressive and ruinous than the Dutch colonial government. And it's been estimated that approximately 4 million people died in the Dutch East Indies as a result of the Japanese occupation. Meanwhile, back in Australia, the Dutch East Indies government in exile established offices at Camp Columbia at Wacol outside of Brisbane. Several Dutch military units, ships and aircraft managed to evacuate to Australia and contributed towards the Allied efforts against the Japanese throughout the war, including commando units operating in the Dutch East Indies. The term Indonesia has been used for the Dutch East Indies geographical location since the late 19th century, and in the early 20th century, local indigenous intellectuals conceived of Indonesia as a nation state. In contrast to the Dutch, the Japanese allowed indigenous leaders to grow influence among the local population, and younger indigenous men received militia training and weapons, setting the stage for a nascent independence movement. Aided by armed militias formed by the Japanese during the occupation, Indonesian nationalists in Java declared Indonesia a republic and independent from the Netherlands 2 days after the Japanese unconditional surrender. The Dutch government, however, was intent on re-establishing control over its lucrative colony, thereby starting a 4-year-long war or police action, now known as the Dutch-Indonesian War or the Indonesian National Revolution. After the Allied meeting at Potsdam and the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August 1945, the Dutch East Indies Territory was subsumed into Lord Louis Mountbatten's overstretched Southeast Asia Command, SEAC, an enterprise known to the cynics, as was mentioned I think earlier on, as Save England's Asian Colonies. But actually, the majority of SEAC's territory and area of responsibility were the former Dutch and French colonies. At this stage of the war, Australian troops were located in parts of the former Dutch East Indies territories, including Borneo, Morotai, Ambon, and Western or Dutch New Guinea. The Australian area of responsibility under SEAC was considerable, as you can see from this map, and like all the Allied forces in the post-conflict occupation, there were too many responsibilities and not enough troops and resources. But the key terrain in Java became a British responsibility, and when they managed to arrive in Java in October, 2 months after the end of the war, they found the nationalists well established and gaining popularity and control. They initially avoided significant conflict with the nationalists. It was only possible for British forces to establish a military government in parts of Indonesia, and a shortage of troops forced the Allies to use the 65,000 surrendered Japanese troops to maintain civil order. The nationalists used Allied prisoners of war and civilians interred by the Japanese as bargaining chips for political ends, and attacked Japanese troops awaiting repatriation to seize their weapons. But before long, British, Indian and Japanese troops found themselves in increasing conflict with the nationalists. A British Indian Army brigadier, AWS Malabi, was killed when he pushed a group of nationalists to surrender their weapons near Surabaya in eastern Java. The British retaliated in strength with a coordinated sweep that began on the 10th of November 1945 under the cover of air attacks. And although the Allied forces largely captured the city in 3 days, the poorly armed nationalists fought for 3 weeks, and thousands died as the population fled to the countryside. Despite the significant defeat suffered by the nationalists, the fight they mounted galvanised the nation in support of independence and helped garner international attention. The Battle of Surabaya has subsequently become a symbolic touchstone of Indonesian independence story and continues to feature in art, books, film, computer games and reenactments. The 10th of November is commemorated, indeed celebrated, in Indonesia as Heroes Day. The British and Australians were reluctant to devote their scarce resources to the defence of Dutch interests and were keen to pull their soldiers out of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial administration returned to Batavia, and throughout 1946, 150,000 Dutch soldiers were mobilised in Holland and relieved the British and Indian forces in the Dutch East Indies. By the end of 1946, all British and Indian soldiers had withdrawn, and the British government had formed the view that momentum lay on the side of the nationalist cause. The British sent high-level representatives to bring the Dutch and Indonesians to the negotiating table. The result of these negotiations was the Linggadjati Agreement, signed on the 15th of November 1946, where the Dutch acknowledged that the nationalists' de facto authority over Java, Sumatra, and Madura. In exchange, the nationalists agreed to discuss a future Commonwealth-like United Kingdom of the Netherlands and Indonesia, effectively a two-state solution. Initially siding with its former Second World War Dutch ally, Australia saw the conflict as an internal matter that didn't warrant UN intervention. But as part of the Linggadjati Agreement, however, Indonesia became an independent member of the UN in late 1946. And this gave the Australian Foreign Minister of the day, H.V. Doc Evatt, cause to argue that the dispute was now between two different countries and therefore warranted further action. With India's support, Evatt raised the dispute with the UN Security Council. A ceasefire was proposed alongside the deployment of military observers who would report breaches to an international committee. And I think somebody else this morning mentioned the first Australian peacekeepers were part of that contingent. But implementation of the Linggadjati Agreement broke down, and the Dutch weren't prepared to let go of their colony just yet. So to reassert full control, the Dutch launched military operations against areas controlled by the nationalists in July of 1947. And in a series of actions, the Dutch successfully regained full control over East and West Java and key parts of Sumatra. The UN called for another ceasefire. The negotiations between the two sides led to another agreement named the Grenville Agreement in January of 1948. The Dutch then established states in the areas that they had reoccupied. A second major Dutch military offensive aimed at destroying the nationalists was launched in December of 1948. And despite recapturing the major cities of Java, including the nationalist capital Yogyakarta, and all of Sumatra except Aceh in the far north, it triggered significant pressure from the US and the UN in the form of several Security Council resolutions. When the US threatened to terminate the much-needed financial aid for the Netherlands under the Marshall Plan, the Dutch had little choice but to agree to the transfer of sovereignty to Indonesia. A Dutch-Indonesian roundtable conference took place in The Hague, and a significant part of the it's a good table, isn't it? And a significant part of the negotiations concerned the payment for Dutch East Indies debts. Indonesia ended up agreeing to pay for the equivalent of 4 billion British pounds as the cost of independence, half of which was the cost that the Dutch had incurred in the military campaigns between 1947 and 1949. So they essentially bought their independence. The Dutch agreed to hand over sovereignty of the Dutch East Indies in December 49, as we know, and what had taken the Dutch 340 years to build was gone in the space of 7 short years. But it wasn't quite over yet. They continued to argue that West New Guinea, or Dutch New Guinea, was a separate and different ethnic region, and that subsequently became a Dutch overseas territory. To emulate the British Commonwealth and French Union post-colonial confederation models, the Dutch managed, however, to convince the United States of Indonesia, as it was called for a short period, to agree to become part of the Dutch-Indonesian Union. The Dutch-Indonesian Union would not have any powers. It would be a consultative body with a permanent secretariat, a court of arbitration to settle any legal disputes, and a minimum of 2 ministerial conferences each year. It would be headed by the Dutch monarch in an entirely symbolic role. However, it was less effective than the French Union of around the same time and less enduring than the British Commonwealth. And the loose union failed primarily due to the ongoing dispute over the Dutch New Guinea. Indonesia unilaterally withdrew from this arrangement in 1954. Sukarno's government subsequently campaigned for Indonesian control of the territory, and with pressure from the US, the Netherlands agreed to cede that territory to Indonesian administration in May of 1963. So in conclusion, the Dutch East Indies is one of the great European colonial experiences that continues to resonate both in the Netherlands and in Indonesia to this day. If it were not for the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies in 1942, there's a good chance that the Indonesian independence movement might never have gotten off the ground. The British, the Americans and Australia all contributed to the independence process. The Dutch fought, bargained, negotiated, fought again to the finish. But after 361 years, their colonial presence in Southeast Asia came to an end. Ironically, the Japanese Empire was defeated, but their objective and mantra, Asia for the Asians, was effectively realised over the next few decades through the process of decolonialisation. And in 1949, Australia had a new Asian neighbour to its north, and that presented its own sets of opportunities and challenges. Thank you.